Hey, listeners, welcome back to the Psychedelic Podcast. I'm your host, Paul F. Austin, and today we are bringing you a special bonus episode. It is a webinar we recently hosted called Visionary Leadership, Revolutionizing Executive Coaching with Psychedelics. This was a free webinar, free training that we hosted about the overlap of psychedelics and leadership transformation. We brought in two guest experts for this conversation. Dr. Amy Albright. Dr. Albright has been a faculty in our practitioner training program. She's a doctor of Chinese medicine and also an executive coach who works both as a coach and strategic advisor with companies from the $10 million to $3 billion range. And she brought in a lot of context around intuition, how to weave higher consciousness into organizations and the way that we approach business. And then we also had Eric Kaufmann, and Eric is a friend of mine, a really renowned executive coach. One of his best known clients is Dr. Bronner's, but he works with a range of executive coaching clients. And he is a master at talking about this overlap of psychedelics and leadership. And he specifically talks about a framework around wisdom, love, and power that I think you will find to be very interesting. So this webinar, we had about 90 people show up live, and everyone was pretty floored by the quality of the conversation. These are two very, very high-level executive coaches. And I provided some, introductory context around some of the neurobiological aspects of psychedelics and what they do specifically on the prefrontal cortex. And then Amy and Eric both did a great job in filling in a lot of gaps and answering some questions from the audience. So I think you're going to really enjoy this conversation, especially if you are a founder, entrepreneur, executive coach, or just a general coach who works at psychedelics. There's a lot of wisdom, knowledge, and depth that you are going to absorb from this conversation. So without further ado, let's go into this bonus episode, Visionary Leadership, How to Revolutionize Executive Coaching with Psychedelics. Eric and Amy, welcome. Great to have you on. Thank you for joining us. So we've got 75 people live on the call today. We did this poll. It's about a quarter. So a quarter are experienced coaches who have maybe started to work with psychedelics, a quarter are coaches who are interested, a quarter aspire to become coaches, and a quarter are, just personally interested. So a bit of a wide swath. And I think the best sort of way to start would just be maybe a brief introduction. Maybe for each of you to spend just a couple minutes on introducing who you are and specifically what have altered states of consciousness meant to you and your work. And Amy, we'll go with you.
Okay. Thank you. Hi, and welcome, everyone. I'm excited to be here and a part of this conversation. My professional background, I studied as a doctor of Chinese medicine. I've been interested in altered states of consciousness since my first spiritual experience, which happened at the age of 18 and had nothing to do with entheogens. It was just a momentary breakthrough in a massively altered state. And the way that my brain is structured, I tend to be able to move in and out of altered states of consciousness very adeptly without using entheogens. So personally, when I use them, I am able to just drop into even more altered states, go further, have a wider aperture of understanding, and hear guidance even better. So when I first started as a Chinese medicine practitioner, it was 22 years ago, and I was having channeled insights and laying on hands and healing and all kinds of things that were not part of my professional or academic training. My background in neurosciences, nothing that I did in medical school made any sense of it. So it's been quite a journey, and incorporating and really growing all of those skills over time. At some point, I did shift from being maybe about 5 years in, even I stopped using needles very much and was just focusing on bringing through the wisdom and the clarity for people, really being able to see into their souls very deeply and handle maladies for them on all levels. But I started to focus about 5 years in more on leaders. And then about 10 years in, I was focusing exclusively on leaders and visionaries and pioneers, with my very first executive coaching gig with a $3 billion company CEO and his executive team and the board. So it was kind of a crash course in that regard. But I learned that my intuitive capacities basically not only could help people to solve the issues in their life, their health, but also in their business. And then I started to work into greater spheres of community. And psychedelics have woven their way in and out. And I absolutely love working, helping to tee people up and integrate their psychedelic experiences. One of my big passions. So I'm excited to be here today to cover what we're covering. It's right in the sweet spot for everything that I'm most passionate about.
Thank you, Amy. And Amy has been a faculty in our training program. She was for a couple years and helped to facilitate and, provided a lot of wisdom specifically to the role of intuition in leadership and as becoming practitioners. And, Eric, I'd love to hand it over to you. What's the brief background? I mean, there's a lot there, but let's open that up.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thanks for the invitation, Paul. Amy, nice to be with you and all the humans around the globe here. I will out myself first by saying that my primary medicine is meditation. And, Paul and I have spent a lot of time discussing that. So I really do, I have my professional background for the last 25 years as an executive coach, working with CEOs and executive teams. I was in corporate before that. I spent 13 years living in a spiritual community, in a commune. And so I was sort of deeply trained in altered states. My teacher was much less fond of altered states of consciousness, and he was much more fond of what he called altered traits of consciousness. And so the idea that an altered state is the temporary movement from one way to another, which, by the way, you can have an altered state of consciousness if you order number 10 spice in a Thai food restaurant, right? You're going to have an altered state of consciousness. You have an altered state of consciousness when you're invited to give a keynote in front of 1,000 people and you step up on stage. That wave of energy that comes at you and all the sort of hormonal changes that are happening in your body is an altered state, right? So there's lots of medicines out there, as it were, that will change us from one state to another. What I'm profoundly interested in as a human being in my own journey and as a coach to executives is what, like I said, what my teacher would call altered traits of consciousness, right? So not dipping in and out of these different ways of experiencing reality for a moment, but can we over time chart an arc where our evolution, our maturity, our depth, our capacity to be more loving towards ourselves and others, be in a state of contentment and self-acceptance, arrive at a place where, when I started my spiritual work and certainly the psychedelic work, I was aiming not unlike you, 18 years old, right? And I would not call my first experiences, big medicine work. They were just drug trips. I was tripping my ass off in various venues. But it did initiate something, right? It did get something spinning. And what I realized, I'm almost 40 years into my spiritual practice, was that much of what drove me at the initial and much of what drives executives and humans to this day is a sense of I'm not enough. I need to get better. I need to fix myself. I need to improve myself. I need to somehow not be who I am. And I think the real beauty and power and the contribution and the gift of the medicine work, whether that medicine is plants, whether that medicine is people, whether that medicine is meditation, is that we can, slowly or quickly, I don't know what the pace is, drop into this place where we're not rejecting ourselves, where we can, as beautifully as we can touch into the cosmos, the serpentine energy that awakens all things, the kundalini power that drives through us. As much as we can do that, if we can drop into ourselves and arrive at a sense of contentment, I think that's where the medicine really flourishes.
It's a beautiful opening from both of you, and I want to build on some of these things. So, where I'd love to bring this conversation next is, as sort of blasé as this may sound, like just curious to hear your definition of an executive coach. What does it mean to be an executive coach? What does it mean to support leaders and change makers and visionaries? And especially, what does it mean to support them in ways that are maybe non-traditional? And how have you found that play out in your own work? And Amy, we'll go back to you for this question and then back to Eric. Okay.
Yeah, I would say to build off of this question and also something that Eric just mentioned, it's really helping people to understand their fundamental enoughness, which sounds really ironic when you're talking with people who seem to have it all. They have the high-paying job, they have the success, they're brilliant and they've invented something and they're pioneering out into a new space and a rapidly growing startup. And internally, they're having a very different experience. And so for myself, I actually go quite a lot over into the advising capacity as well. So my role is executive coach and advisor, but done in a very spiritual and I'll say even multidimensional way where I'm taking care of and attending to who they are. And again, this is my method, my way. I am attending to who they are in alignment on their soul's journey. Like, who are they really and what are they here to do? What is their business really and what is that business intended to do? And aligning everything so that it is it's very coherent. It's very in integrity, and that people can live kind of not just knowing that they're enough, but understanding the truth of who they are and their majesty and what they're really here to do. And that's where I really see them flourish. And yes, I can translate that into different languages. I think that part of what maybe all of us have an interest in, if we're on this call, is the ability to walk between the different realities. Like, I can speak corporate speak and I can transfer and translate all these messages into an ROI, but I can also, I think it's important for us to work with clients in such a way where we're addressing them on such a deeper and more human level than that. So kind of just moving from like maybe the more heady space that a lot of executive coaching might be in. For me, it's important that I cover all of it. And that's been massive in my work as an executive coach and as a strategic advisor. Really, it's very deeply holistic. Yeah.
Eric? So the question is, what is an executive coach in essence? There's two ways to answer that question, right? One answer is whatever the hell you want it to be, So I don't mean to be flip about it, but that is sincere, right? Because there's a wide swath of where you land, right? So that's one answer. Another answer is, an executive coach. I'll speak of my, the CEO of XYZ company comes and says, Eric, let's work together. I want to work with you. Fundamentally, he or she is asking that I engage with them in a way that ends up having them be somehow different than they were before. I mean, that's about as fundamental as we can get, right? And what does that different mean? Well, within the executive coach, as it pertains to the world where in my case, like 90% of my clients are company paid, right? So I don't have people individually paying me out of the pocket. The business is investing in this as a developmental opportunity for their executive, right? So these are well-respected, well-paid executives. The company is paying for it. So they're fundamentally saying, we want to do something to be able to be more effective as an executive and drive better results for the business, right? So any way I slice it, nobody's hiring me because I'm going into businesses. Nobody's hiring me just to feel good, right? Or to be sort of whole. What they don't know often is for them to be driving better results, there is a level of human evolution that's required. Not just sort of another understanding of how to read financial sheets or how to optimize your time and motion, structures in the business. There's something that has to evolve because, especially at the CEO level, the company cannot outperform or outrun the CEO's consciousness.
That's right.
The company can't outrun or outperform the CEO's capacity. And so my role in this case is to sort of raise their consciousness and raise their capacity so they can create, more room ahead of them to bring more people with them. And I not unlike Amy, and sort of not surprising as Paul sort of pulled this together, right? We have these things in common. So I describe my work as an unrelenting commitment to results with an unyielding regard for spirit. And that's how I go forth into my work. An unrelenting commitment to results. We're going to lock arms. We're going to do what's necessary to really drive the production side of the world, right? With an unyielding regard for spirit. There's no way I'm going to be in dialogue and relationship with the executive and not have this deep respect for what spirit wants as well.
So, and that's a word that's continued to come up for both of you, which knowing both of you quite well is no surprise. And yet there's this kind of context of business is very much a profane activity, right? If we're to use the word sacred and profane, spiritual and not spiritual. And yet I think we would all agree, and there would be a lot of people in our audience today who would also agree with this, that maybe one of the great tasks of this century, for lack of a better term, is, how do we weave the sacred back into this sort of frame that a lot of people perceive as negative or, distasteful or whatever that might be. And you both have Eric lived in a commune for 13 years. Amy was a doctor, basically of acupuncture for 10 years. So you both come from deep sort of healing and community backgrounds, and yet you've chosen to step into the business realm in this way. So I'd love just to hear you talk a little bit about what does it mean to weave spirit or weave the sacred back into a business environment. What good and what impact that can have that makes it sort of meaningful or worth doing in your eyes.
I can start, Eric, and then if you want to build, because I feel like mine is a lot in response. So one of the things that you said is that the company cannot outgrow or outperform over the level of consciousness of the CEO. And so I believe the same thing. I talk about that all the time. The hologram of what's happening inside of the CEO or inside of leadership in general is going to replicate out. And so bringing that person into an understanding that they actually have a commitment, not just to look okay or to like do image management or show up nicely inside of meetings, but to actually grow and develop themselves in ways that are unseen maybe to the team or are less tangible. And to your point, Eric, the field of executive coaching is whatever we want it to be. The way that we approach getting those fantastic results is kind of like that all happens behind closed doors. If I see someone though that is not aligning, they have maybe piecemeal or non-integrated integrity. That is definitely one of the things. So to come back to your question, Paul, how to bring the sacred in. I see everything as sacred and actually, and that includes business in a fundamental level. And I would then just help people to purge out what is not sacred, the places where they are acting out of integrity or where they're acting from ego or, it's too transactional and it doesn't have any depth to it. Just clear that stuff out of the way because the beauty can still remain almost in every situation, in every person. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, I think that there's a final point that you brought that really sort of stirs something for me because I was thinking about your comment, Paul, about business being profane or dirty or on, sort of the various words we can use about it. And, I have daughters that are 23 and 21 and I hear them and their friends talking about sort of this, the corruption, the unfairness, the power tripping, the misogyny, whatever, sort of all these things. And yes, to all that. There's a lot of bullshit going on. But I think you used the word ego, Amy, right? And so we have sort of this domain where the human ego gets to dance, and it doesn't dance in this beautiful sort of way. It's often an ugly dance, right? But I'm not sure that a soccer game is any more sacred or any less profane, or Thanksgiving dinner with our family brings up our heckles, not our sense of joy. It's like, oh my God, we got to go to Christmas with Mom and Thanksgiving with Uncle Ruff. It's like, so, back to my sort of bias towards the altered states versus altered trait of consciousness. I think that's the work of executive coaching that I really want to lean into. I know you lean into, Paul. I'm sure you do, Amy. This is where we get really goddamn interesting, right? It's like, how do we move the conversation from altered states of consciousness, which has a certain level of, entertainment to itself. There's, I have a bit of an issue, quite frankly, with altered states of consciousness held in sort of out of context. And by that, I mean, we all go to Costa Rica for ecotourism because, Costa Rica has done a fabulous job, like, protecting the entire country and making one big park. I freaking love Costa Rica. I wish they made the streets a little wider, but that's a whole different issue. It wouldn't be an ecosystem, but but with this ecotourism, and now we've sort of cultivated to go back to Costa Rica for psychotourism, right? We can take a trip into the psyche and come out illuminated with some pictures and images and some insights. It's fabulous. It's not enough, and I think what we're being drawn into, what the opportunity for us, and it's an opportunity because the crisis is legit, right? My observation is that the power to shape the planet has slipped away from kings and queens and priests and churches and has landed squarely in the hands of completely unprepared executives of organizations. Business now runs the world. Like it or don't, doesn't matter. It is what it is. We're watching corporate money shape elections, right? We're watching corporate people shape the space, the space race, to say nothing about, our sense of fashion or, fairness or justice. So much of it is being driven by business. So in the matter of whether it's profane or not profane, we are at this juncture where for us to be able to be effective stewards of the human spirit and the globe and the great spirit is to lean in and ensure that leaders and executives and all people in organizations, but it's still, the power resides at the top still, that they get switched on, right? Not just intellectually, but I want every executive to have a felt sense experience of the interconnectedness of all being. That picture behind you, Paul, is this gorgeous expression, right? You see that shamanic vibe of the human and the non-human worlds woven together. And when executives, and I know this for a fact, right? When humans can touch upon that interconnectedness, it changes their perspective, their behavior, and their conduct. That's to me where the sacred and the profane blend.
Yeah, we're heaven and earth meet, Amy.
I was just, I don't want to blame business for what's actually a consciousness topic or what is a greater paradigm. Business is run by people. And essentially we're here to serve and heal and work with people and our own selves. That's another piece is as we look to guide other folks, we don't just need amazing, like kind of 3D training, XYZ steps, but how are we actually not just implementing the stuff we've learned in coaching school or wherever, but actually learning in a deep way about our own journey and about as you put it, the altered traits of consciousness. Are we guiding ourselves in that way? And that's one of the things I know that there's so much inside the PCI training that Paul was talking about is really bringing people through their own growth process while also learning about the psychedelic work. And that is so huge because I feel like, to your point, Eric, we can't just none of this is compartmentalized. It is really inside of that interconnectedness. We are one group of people, regardless of where we live. We are all on the same team, even if it doesn't look like it. And being able to work inside of that space, it really does require that we're evolving in that way and not just finger pointing, because all of that, business is bad or this group it's not getting us anywhere, So when we start to get into that, it's time to keep looking and diving in on ourselves and finding the deeper answers.
Fantastic. Yeah. This is great. I have one more question myself, and we're starting to see some questions come in from the audience, and I would encourage questions to continue to come in because these are some good ones. Both of you mentioned at the beginning, Amy, you mentioned, or maybe I mentioned, your work with neurofeedback as this cutting edge technology that you've been utilizing for many years. Eric, you've been a long-term meditator. I've trained with both of you. I've done the neurofeedback intensive with Amy, and I've done Eric's meditation retreats as well. And I'd love to just hear you talk about some of the overlap or intersection between psychedelics and the specific technology that you work with. And I'll just sort of leave that open-ended. Where is the marriage between psychedelics and neurofeedback, or even psychedelics and meditation? How might they even sort of weave together potentially as modalities? And it'll likely build on some of the things that have already been coming up today about altered states to altered traits and integration and applied practices and, even neuroplasticity for that matter. So kind of however you each want to take that, would love to just open that up as an invitation.
Okay.
You want to keep the pattern, Amy, or break it?
Yeah, sure. We can keep the pattern just so that everybody. Yeah. Okay. So, neurofeedback therapy, just as a general context, is the brain is able in neurofeedback therapy to understand what it's doing, and so there are sensors put onto the scalp. There's not any input put into the brain. It's simply the brain information, hundreds of thousands of data points, extremely complex, being fed into a computer. And then in milliseconds later, it's being fed back to that person's brain. So this has been traditionally used for schizophrenia, PTSD, depression, ADD. It also, though, and this is the part that myself, my colleague, Dr. Drew Pearson, and I are most interested in, is incredible for not just getting rid of like the pathologies, the overthinking, the ruminations, the sleep problems, the whatever, but also really building in wisdom and consciousness, bringing somebody into a state where they can drop away, let's just say, their crap in all regards, not just the stories, but the ways that their brain is not functioning in an optimal format and is wasting a lot of power and not able to achieve a broader state of well-being and an expanded consciousness. So it's like, just drop all of that stuff away. And then we see really beautiful gifts emerge, really incredible healing capacities, intuitive capacities. And to the point that has been said so many times, this is my first time really talking with Eric. So it's fun to see how on the same page we are. We are not in our work about creating mystical experiences as much as we are creating deeply mystical beings, deeply aware beings. Because the neurofeedback therapy can be used in such a way that we can create similar to a psychedelic experience for many people. They're having full visions. They're in very altered states of consciousness. And it's not that we suppress that, but we're building out fundamental structures in their brain and in their whole being simultaneously that allow them to live that in an integrated way. So, in 5 days, let's say we can get a 40% change on average in someone's brain in the things that we're going after changing. It's a radical amount of change. And I would say the distinction here and the overlap with psychedelics isn't just that there's altered states, but kind of like this dovetail. So psychedelics are, let's talk a little, I'll say it in psilocybin because there's so many different types, but in general, psychedelics are going to open the awareness. They're going to create a different state of being. The person doesn't know how they got there. In the case of psilocybin, they're very clear that they're interconnected. They're very clear that, maybe that's what's happening for them anyways. But then when that psychedelic experience fades, they don't necessarily know how to get back to that state. And they don't necessarily know how to fully integrate all of it. And I would say with psychedelics, no matter what topic we're on, it is so much about the tee up, the depth, the earnestness with which we approach them, and then the depth with which we integrate them. And so I feel like that with the neurofeedback therapy, we've had people come through that have been working with psychedelics for decades. And they get massive, massive return because basically our EEG and our ability to look into the brain goes towards that maybe like 1 square inch somewhere in the brain that hasn't been performing well, that's been hogging too much energy, that's been, I'll say, perpetuating the lies of the sense of self or the pain that exists for that person. And so we'll just quiet that area. We'll just tell it, hey, chill out. And then boom, it's like a massive and very robust integration of all of the work. It almost feels like that it creates this avalanche of an integration of the work that they've done, in and out of psychedelics, in just in a very short period of time. So I love the holism of it, and I love the precision and the science of it. And I also love, encouraging folks to interweave their psychedelics practice as well, because that it opens things in yet a different way. So they're complementary tools that I love both so much.
Thank you, Amy. And Eric, what about you?
I was engrossed in what Amy was saying. The question is sort of the intersection of where these, in my case, sort of meditation and psychedelics, as it were. I think about folks who are going into ceremony. If we hold ceremony as kind of a structured space where we're doing, an intentional experience with some medicine, right? it's intended to be disruptive, right? If we want to heal, if we want to go to your point about healing, right? And I think that, as we climb up the ladder of sort of growing in our lives, and I'll use the word growing. I don't know a better word. I don't love it. I just don't know a better one, right? But but as we're climbing this ladder, there's sort of, there are the rungs that we put our foot on, one foot after the other, and then there are the two rails, I guess, on the side of a ladder. Is that what they're called, right? And so I see one rail as the rail of healing, and one rail is the rail of capacity, right? Capacity means that I can grow more, be more disciplined, be more loving, be more, purposeful, be more attentive, right? And then one's healing, right? I can resolve sort of the, being undermined by my mother, or being, really injured by, various life experiences, right? So we sort of climb foot after foot going up, and then healing capacity, healing capacity, healing capacity. And I think that, when we go into an altered state in this intentional way, I think we're describing, as opposed to when I would take mushrooms and go to the Grateful Dead concert, right? That was a very different sort of setup. We have to sort of cultivate the healing and the capacity. To me, I'm not sure simultaneously, like one-to-one, but they have to happen, in concert. And I find a tremendous focus on the healing side, and insufficient focus on the capacity side, right? And so, and we're kind of awash in, we're all aware of how traumatized we've all been in life, and so there's this massive focus on healing. And so there's people who are doing this wonderful work on healing and haven't built up the capacity. And so it's almost like you're going to charge this battery, but the battery capacity isn't well cultivated. So the healing doesn't quite generate the power that we'd hoped it would generate, because the capacity has to grow too. So coming back to this question, I think, to me, meditation can be used very much for healing, but really it's a capacity building sort of approach, right? And what do I mean by that? I'm going to sit here for half an hour. I'm going to sit here for an hour. I'm going to sit for a day, 3 days. I spent a year in a silent retreat, meditating 8 hours a day. That was insane. Literally, I almost killed myself. There's a whole story I can tell, but it was incredibly difficult, right? But what am I basically doing as I'm sitting there in meditation, right? I'm coming back to my breath. Well, how goddamn unsexy is that? It's not nearly as exciting as a mushroom trip, right? But what am I doing? Second after second, minute after minute, hour after hour, day after day, month after month. I'm building this capacity to be intentional, to be at choice, to cultivate actual agency, right? This is the beautiful thing that the meditation practice brings, is that I cultivate agency. That is a massive capacity. Now, if I bring agency, my ability to be at choice, into an altered state with a plant medicine, where I'm invited into surrender, into openness, into discovery, into curiosity, into the yin side of the space. But I can dance in that space with a capacity for choice. I'm now having a relationship with the plant medicine, rather than sort of being the child showing up, tell me what to do. I find it often problematic that a lot of these, altered states and medicines have been sort of, again, elevated to the next parental figure, or divine figure, or instructive figure. Why are we losing sight of our own maturity and the capacity to be agents of our lives, let alone sovereign in our lives? And to me, that's where the meditation medicine, bringing into the altered states of medicine, really creates a container where more of my human beingness, right, to be a conscious being at choice, sort of gets switched on. And then we do that over time, and the altered states don't fade away, as Amy said. They build on each other, and they become the altered traits. And when I'm saying altered traits, I don't think it's any different than what you're describing as integration, Paul, right? Because that's what the integration is. It says, don't let this thing be a fading memory. Let it begin to shift the DNA at the physical level, let alone the mimetic level of who we believe ourselves to be and take ourselves to be. And so that's where I see the relationship. And I think that people who are sincere about their medicine practice, about their altered state practice, who are not also sincere about meditation, are seriously shortchanging their experiences. Mm. Meditation is not fun. It's not sexy. It's not cool. It's mostly boring and hard work. But it is the sort of like, what it is, it's devotion. Why do I meditate every day? I am devoted. What am I devoted to? I'm devoted to the truth. I'm devoted to unpacking the possibility of what arises in this expression of this being in this lifetime. Not to be better than anyone else, but to be in deep gratitude to the remarkable spirit that has manifested as this being. So I sit down and I shut up and I meditate so that I can cultivate capacity. Then you bring in a medicine, it becomes a much more interesting thing. And the third part, and I think this is obvious here, is if meditation is one part, medicine is the other, elder work is the third, right? How do we engage with people that can help us make sense of what went down, right? Because if we only have to make sense within the echo chamber of our experience, we're going to end up often reformatting the past into a new version into the future rather than something disruptive, something truly innovative. So I think meditation for capacity, the medicine for opportunity, possibility, growth, expansion, and the elder work for integration and sort of sense making.
Beautiful. And I'm so mindful of our time because I know all three of us could probably talk for another hour, and we do have some fantastic questions that have come through as well that are actually building on some of the points that Eric and Amy were just making, and one of them is from Mark, and we'll start here. And there's a few others as well, and I would encourage the audience, if you have other questions that come up, we're going to spend now about 5 or 10 minutes on questions. And the one from Mark is, and maybe each of you can spend maybe about a minute or so we can make sure that we have plenty of time to get to some of the other questions. How best to integrate these experiences, insights, revelations, consciousness, specifically into corporate and business environment? Because I think, we talk about the sort of leader sets the tone. And yet when a leader goes through their own transformative process, especially if they're in a large organization, that takes time to ripple through. So how can those internal changes that a leader is going through start to ripple out into external changes in the organization that they are helping to lead? Maybe 2 minutes, if you can.
Go ahead. No, go ahead if you want. I feel like you have it ready.
How to integrate these experiences into the workplace. My first sort of line of response to that is don't do it alone, right? Mm-hmm. The community aspect, who else are you working with to help keep this alive? Whether it's in your company or not in the company. We especially in the US, have this sort of fascination with autonomy. Often we think of agency as I alone. You come down a sort of golden elevator, escalator, and you go, I alone can save the world, right? That's sort of the epitome of our narcissistic delusion. The reality, I think, of being able to implement it is that it's in community. So who are the people with whom you regularly interact, who know what you're up to and are supporting you in this effort, right? I'm saying, so I'm proposing that we default, and I'll keep this only 10 seconds longer, but we default to think that our behaviors is the most important thing, where in fact, every tradition that's ever helped people evolve has created a system that drives behavior. And we have sort of taken the system, thrown it to the side, saying we can be dilettantes about the system. It's all about behavior because it's all about whatever I want. That just doesn't work that way in any aspect of nature nor in human experience. And so if you want to integrate, have a cohort of people with whom you are engaging on a regular basis to keep this alive.
Yeah. And Amy, I'd love if you could build on that because you both are doing this in your own ways. I mean, Amy she's been doing these intensives and has recently started a mystery school. Eric has just launched a new program called the Conscious Leadership Academy, where he's doing this with executive teams in particular. So I'm glad you spoke to what is the system, that folks are coming back into or helping to build.
Yeah. And I think that that's essential because part of the shadow side of corporate America or business as it stands in most places is the feeling of isolation. And the isolation is the cause of so much pain, so much holding in a voice, so much not, being uncertain about oneself and how to create effective change. So I agree about community, the consistent touch points and having that. It's the mystery school that I have is a modern mystery school. So it is not based in Egypt or anything like that. It is truly the teaching that has come through me and my understanding. And it ends up being a group coaching experience. And it also weaves together everything from, it's basically how to work inside of the field of creation. I'll keep it very short here. And be a massively effective person in the 3D world while having a deep spiritual connection. So the other piece that I wanted to go back to, just with the question that was asked by Mark, is it's so important to be integrated enough that you then don't become like that spiritual ego in the workplace that thinks you're holier than thou because you've had an insight. So it's like finding that sweet spot between innovation and just going for it and taking some chances on being different than what the rest of the culture has been or how you've been historically in the workplace. And also making sure that you're integrated enough that you're not just espousing a bunch of stuff that you don't understand well enough. You've seen this, right, Eric? So, because if it's not integrated, then you'll receive criticism or it will fall short. So it's kind of finding that sweet spot. Yeah. What's the next question?
I'm laughing because I recently had a dear friend of mine sort of take his first medicine, his first psilocybin ceremony, and he came out of it going, "I know my purpose in life is to promote psilocybin in the world." I'm like, okay, slow down, brother. You know, I mean, we all had that purpose for a minute, but
it takes time to let it sink in, right? You need,
and I think that's, and I want to sort of, you know, if I may just echo a little bit on Amy's point, right? This, so that how do you integrate it in? You know, there's some patience required, right? I really perceive that the work of this sort of growth has a lot to do with our own maturity, and a big part of maturity is, you know, patience and timing. You know, so you know, you've had one experience, soak it all in, and then, you know, and I'll say I'm a real big fan of not like boiling the ocean, but 10%. You know, what is a 10% evolutionary shift that you can bring into your day-to-day that would represent your new insight? You know, to me, that's always the invitation to folks, right? You're going to go back to your team on Monday. What's a 10% shift that will represent the insight that you've had? And so it takes a little pressure off having to be totally different.
I love that. One more question, and then we'll kind of see what we are at with time. It's from Nate. Nate's an entrepreneur and has a perception that the business environment in the US is heavily masculine, right? And so what do we need to do to start a conversation around feminine energy amongst those in the C-suite in an effort to restore balance?
It's a loaded question. You walk in with feminine and masculine to most like bigger size, medium size and bigger corporations. And those paradigms aren't necessarily super comfortable. I think that it might be more grounded if we talk about it in terms of heart, we talk about it in terms of truth, and if we talk about it in terms of communication or authenticity, because it doesn't polarize. Because I don't think that the most of the leadership teams and boardrooms are still full of men, and men don't necessarily want to be wrong for being a man or being indoctrinated into the same system that we all have been indoctrinated into. They're doing their best too. So I understand the question, and I really value it, Nate. And I think it's a super important one. And I think that if we drop the duality, we can actually transcend into another level of reality together. And having people understand that, you know, it's really in the corporate world, when we're talking about team dynamics, it's so much about safety. And the real safety that comes is only going to be there if the CEO is deeply, deeply, deeply involved. For myself, I don't like to coach executives unless I'm coaching their CEO, because I have to hold the CEO radically accountable for the entire cultural change. Otherwise, usually those executives end up less happy because they can see the shortcomings of their other leaders, and it becomes more painful, and they might end up leaving or, you know, whatever, which isn't the end of the world. But I prefer to make sure that the change has to be deep. It has to be integral for each person and that is in it. And I also really prefer to make sure that the entire organization is moving together. I know that's not always possible, but that is my approach. No matter what, I do believe we really get that change when everybody's moving together.
Thank you, Amy. Eric?
I'm a middle-aged white guy, 6'5", 220 pounds. So when I walk into the room, nobody's going to look at me and go, "Oh, feminine energy," right? And so I have to dance that line very, mindfully, as it were. And so rather than getting into the masculine, feminine, a little bit like Amy's answer, I walk in with a sort of triune model that I work with all my executives and all the companies that I work with, and I describe sort of this awakening to conscious leadership from what I consider sort of an egomyopic state. This is my number one, my definition of the number one barrier to executive, my number one barrier to executive effectiveness is what I've come to call egomyopia, right? Not being able to see and manage the ego. And the solution is moving towards being a conscious leader rather than an egomyopic leader. And the triune model that I have that I brought forward, it's my newest book is about that. I describe it as wisdom, love, and power. And so we get into a conversation, into practices, into processes around how do we cultivate, integrate, and align wisdom, love, and power. And so there's a feminine, there's a masculine, there's a blend. Wisdom is the capacity to see below the surface and beyond the obvious, right? Can I really see things from a wisdom perspective? Love, really I describe it as giving without expectations. So we get into the whole notion of nurturing and supporting and caring and giving and listening. And power, which is being able to bring forth our genius within relaxed presence, right? So how do we switch on our personal power? So that's what I get into: wisdom, love, and power. And then there's a feminine, there's a masculine, and then I have a whole construct around the barriers to wisdom, love, and power, the activators to wisdom, love, and power. But we are getting into the conversation about an integrated person without falling into the sort of into the challenge of having to make it more binary.
Right. Yeah. That was handled very well by both of you. So we're at the hour. I had asked both of you to come until top of the hour. It's 11 a.m. PT. So I just want to thank both Dr. Amy and Eric for joining us for this incredible webinar. I'm getting some private messages, even on LinkedIn. I put my LinkedIn that people have connected. Thank you to Eric and Amy, and connect with them on LinkedIn. I know there were some people asking about coaching and some of their programs that they're up to. So it was good to have you here. Thank you both.
Thank you, Paul. Wonderful to be with you, Amy.
Same. Really enjoyed it.
Hey listeners, Paul here. Thank you so much for tuning in to today's episode. If you enjoyed this, share this with a friend of yours who's an executive coach or an entrepreneur or a founder, someone who you think may benefit from having more context and understanding about why psychedelics are such powerful tools for those of us who are in leadership positions. Leave us a review on Spotify or iTunes or wherever you're listening to this, and you can join the conversation on our free community platform at community.thethirdwave.co. I'm Paul. We're signing off now. Thanks again for tuning in. Thanks so much for watching, and don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. The psychedelic space is evolving every day, and we have a ton of amazing content that's coming out, and subscribing is the best way to keep up to date with all of that great content.